Well, in Africa, around 30 million people were pushed into extreme poverty in 2021, and about 22 million jobs were lost in the same year because of the pandemic. Now, this trend continues through the second half of 2022 and on into 2023 owing to the economic disruptions stemming from the Russia-Ukraine war. From insecurity, food shortages, inflation to shortage of gas, Africa has been significantly affected. How well is the continent doing to improve its economic outlook, and what solutions are in place for the growing issues of the continent? We'll unpack all of them here on The Square. Welcome, I'm Sulaiman.
And I'm Kemini Amana.
Barely a month ago, President Buhari of Nigeria presented the largest budget proposal ever to the country's parliament. Now, this comes as the country is currently facing several issues ranging from security to education, dwindling economy, oil theft, unemployment, and more. In the meantime, in Ghana, the situation is slightly different as the country is also grappling with runaway inflation, as prices of basic commodities have spiraled and government finances are also at their weakest in years. The economic slowdown had a considerable impact on households. Ghana's local currency, the cedi, is now the world's lowest performer against the US dollar, a signal of the depth of the country's economic crisis. No doubt, Africa is blessed with diverse human and natural resources. The issue is, how can these countries save themselves from economic distress? Now, joining us to unpack this is Gbolahan Olojede. He's the Executive Director, DMA Advisory and Management Services Limited. And of course, pretty much later, we'll also be speaking with Leslie Mensah, who is an economist. He'll be joining us live from Ghana. Well, Gbolahan, good to see you, and thanks for your time as always. And here we are. Quite a number of issues that the country is grappling with. We'll still come back to the breaking story of the intention of the move by Nigeria's central bank, talking about some currencies that may have a new face or identification. By and large, paint us a picture of the economic situation vis-a-vis what we're going through in Ghana.
Okay, Nigeria has, the complexion of Nigeria's problem is slightly different in certain perspectives, though, than most of the other African countries. But all the same, all the African countries are affected by issues of food security. They are affected by the global energy crisis, which is affecting every part of the world. Why I said the Nigeria situation is slightly different in a certain perspective is that for some of African countries who are currently in serious debt crisis, they have a much smaller GDP to Nigeria. In fact, some of these countries' GDP will be ranking side by side with the GDP of Lagos State. You know, but the problem, why the Nigeria problem has certain peculiarities to it is the fact that Nigeria has a huge GDP, but it has been unable to translate this huge GDP to a substantial government revenue. And that is why we see situations in which what will have been a sustainable debt, a debt of $100 billion US, or something trillion naira, has become unsustainable because there is no revenue to repay this debt. The little revenue that Nigeria makes is barely enough to even cover the debt that we're talking about, not to talk of having things to spend for his own internal people that he has to satisfy. So global energy prices, which has seen the prices of almost anything energy go up, the price of gas, diesel, or aviation fuel, we've seen all of that. In fact, it is Nigeria that is deliberately holding the brakes on the price of PMS. That is another kettle of fish entirely. and the fuel subsidy that we are pumping into that place and how much it is gulping is another problem on it in itself. Then we now have to deal with the issues of food security, which is being aggravated by flooding. Initially, it was insecurity that was a critical driver of some of the drawbacks we have in food security. Now, flooding might have added to it, and the result of that we might start to see in a month or thereabout. We need to begin to see that as part of the problem. Okay.
Well, in the backdrop of what you have just said, Nigeria coming out of COVID is one of 3 countries that was projected to do pretty well. And based on what you have said, that we can also say that there also seems to be the inability to reach some of those projections. Tell us why there's always a difference between those projections and the reality on the ground.
Okay, projections are in the budget. I assume you're talking about projections in the budget. The projection in the budget are based on certain assumptions. So you assume you will produce 1.8 million barrels of oil per day. But in August, we did now around 72,000. In September, we did now around 36,000. That is barely half of what we projected we were going to do. So we begin to fall dramatically short on the revenues. Once we fall short on the revenues, all other things are affected. Our capacity to fund the infrastructure, the capital expenditure, our capacity to pay our debt. So because the debt payment, unfortunately, is called non-discretionary, which means it's not within your hand to control it. When the obligation falls due, it is expected that you must meet that obligation as a matter of priority. So if you don't make the revenue, then you're going to have a problem when you use the little revenue you make to pay debt. There is nothing left at all to pay. So essentially, the assumptions are the basis for the floor, why we have projections being totally different from what we eventually get on the actual base.
Right. Now, while we are talking about debt management, one of the countries that is reeling and the huge debts in Africa is Ghana. And joining us from there is Dwight Mensah. He's an economist and research fellow at the Institute of Fiscal Studies in Accra, Ghana. Good evening to you, Leslie, and many thanks for joining us here. Now, diagnose to us the problem of Ghana. Once upon a time, it was one of the touted one of the best economies or growing economies on the continent. What changed?
Well, Ghana's problem is essentially a fiscal crisis that has metamorphosed into a broader crisis on the back of recent debt shocks. Okay, so prior to the outbreak of the pandemic, that government finances
were in a terrible state. Indeed, before the outbreak of the pandemic, Ghana's debt service burden was already the 3rd highest in the world. Now, this situation made the country extremely vulnerable to any shock that, if it was to be struck by. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, all right. So I was saying that this situation made the country extremely vulnerable to external shocks. And we have had 2 of those shocks in the last 2 years. And the reason for the apparent disproportionate impact of the Russia-Ukraine war and the COVID-19 pandemic shocks on Ghana is due to the extremely vulnerable state of the public finances before the shock. And what we have now is an economy in crisis. The cost of living is rising at the highest rate in 2 decades, with inflation currently running at 37.2%, which is about 3 times where inflation stood at the end of last year. We have also seen a large depreciation of the Ghana cedi, Ghana's currency. The rate of depreciation at this time of the year is the worst since Ghana adopted a flexible currency regime in the 1990s. In the face of these developments, we're seeing the economy begin to slow down. Economic activity is slowing down, obviously, because cost of living has surged, because the exchange rate is weak, and now Ghana is talking to the IMF in order to agree a program to bring back some confidence. So this is where Ghana is now.
Let me jump in here. I'll come to you, Leslie. Thanks for making that clear for Africans watching. Gbolahan, for you and Leslie, there's something I love about both of you trying to break it down, because when people talk about economies or numbers, it's usually vague for some. Now, we've seen how statements, actions, and sometimes policies on its own, and even some activities on their own, would ultimately affect positively the economy of a country. For instance, we just witnessed the UK new Prime Minister, and we saw in less than 48 hours, the pound sterling is looking good. Paint for us a picture of what we're not getting right in both countries, Ghana and Nigeria, in terms of rejigging or activating something that may cause a positive effect around these countries.
Okay. The effect we saw on the pound by virtue of change of government is the vote of confidence. Now, if the market felt otherwise, like we saw when the last governor of the Bank of Reserve in England decided to take certain steps, of course, the pound went down to an all-time low where it was almost equal to the dollar. That is also a vote of no confidence. So it is the confidence of the market in the economy that determines that kind of appreciation that we're talking about. In the case of a country like Nigeria or any part of Africa, there are certain economic distortions that the world has been looking forward to us to be able to change. I'll give you an example, fuel subsidy. Fuel subsidy is one of those issues that the world has seen how this has been going. Everybody is aware that this is a deep hole of unaccountability. A lot of fraud and scam are associated with this PMS subsidy. But Nigeria, for decades, have refused to confront this issue. So these are the kind of things that do not give the right level of confidence to the international world that something is about to change. But when they see a change of leadership often represents the possibility of certain change in direction. So the markets will have been listening now to what some of the candidates are saying. So depending on which candidates eventually come on board and start to take policy direction that the world believes, the market believes, will lead Nigeria out of the wood, the market will react positively if we're doing more of the right thing or taking the right policy. But if we continue along the same line, we are not going to see those reactions from the market.
And quickly here, okay, I can see Leslie now. Let me go to Leslie. Gbolahan, I'll come back to you quickly. Leslie, listen to Gbolahan, because we also saw the protest in Ghana. There was also the last Arise Ghana, and it was all about the economy. If the ordinary Ghanaian or the ordinary Nigerian out there understands the pain, the pang, the change in the economy, how is it so difficult for sometimes the cabinet of these elected and appointed officers to understand some of the key things you can turn out from your research institute?
Well, as I said earlier, Ghana's public finances, in other words, the financial state of the country, are in extraordinarily bad shape. Ghana's debt service burden, as I said earlier, is the third highest in the world presently. The only two countries with higher debt service obligations think about them, are Sri Lanka and Lebanon. So it's an extraordinary situation, such that there are no easy solutions, as may be the case, for example, in the UK, where the change of the leader at the helm did turn the market around. In Ghana's case, what the market really is looking for now is an external anchor, i.e. the International Monetary Fund. The market is looking for an external anchor that will issue its imprimatur, on the government's policies, and thereby restore some confidence to investors. At the moment, investors have been fleeing the domestic bond market, and that has contributed to the run on the currency. Investors are jettisoning government bonds and quickly trying to convert their investments into dollars to transfer to other places, and that has put enormous pressure on the exchange rate. We have seen, social unrest, amidst this crisis, and that is partly because for many young people, such a crisis has not occurred in their lifetimes. We haven't seen the cost of living rise at this rate in about 20 years. And if you consider the fact that the median age of Ghana's population is around 21, and for a lot of people, this is actually the first time they are seeing a crisis of this magnitude. The way forward really, and particularly for Ghana, is to reverse the large and destructive buildup in public debt and debt service obligations over the last decade. And so actually, we should be looking forward to a period of significant austerity, because that is really the only reasonable way back to a normal situation.
Leslie, sounds like a tall order for the finance minister of Ghana at the moment. But one of the things that the Central Bank of Ghana has tried to do to salvage the plummeting city is attempted to buy back dollars from foreign companies, particularly mining and oil firms. It has blown back in its face. Tell us why that did not work.
Well, Ghana is facing a hard currency crunch. The balance of payments position, which essentially is the gap between the total inflows of dollars into the economy from exports and investment and total outflows of dollars to pay for imports and to service debt. That has been in deficit throughout this year, and is the first deficit in 4 years. So in the past 3 years, Ghana recorded surpluses. So more dollars came into the economy than left the economy in each of the last 3 years. This year is a reverse, and the gap in the first 6 months of the year alone was $2.5 billion, which is more than a quarter of the central bank's reserves. So the central bank has been plugging this gap between dollar outflow and inflow since the start of the year to the tune of more than $2 billion. And the central bank is running out of reserves. And speculators are seeing this, and therefore they have launched a speculative attack on the currency, knowing that the central bank's capacity to intervene to defend the exchange rate has been seriously undermined. So the little effort to buy more dollars from multinational mining companies was never going to be sufficient to plug the substantial gap in the balance of payments. So that really is a reality of Ghana's situation. It was never going to be enough. In fact, the central bank a few days ago said it had only been able to buy about $80 million from the mining companies when the external gap is in excess of $2 billion.
Right. I want to talk to Gbolahan now because the problem with currency depreciation seems to run through many African countries. What would you say is the cause of this?
But I didn't hear that. Sorry.
I'm saying that the problem of currency depreciation, maybe not as bad as we're seeing in Ghana at the moment, runs through a lot of African countries. What is the cause of this?
Okay, at the heart of currency instability or volatility or depreciation has actually been the poor level of foreign exchange earning by most African countries. You take a Nigerian example. While oil and gas represent barely 9% of the GDP of Nigeria, I mean, probably even less, 7%. Oil and gas is 90% of the FX earnings of Nigeria. So if a product constitutes 90% of your forex earnings, and then from November 2005, when we hit 2.5 million barrels per day production, last month, it was 936,000. So your capacity to earn forex has reduced dramatically from that of you producing 2.5 million to that of you now producing 936. Now, because we have not grown other services or goods that you can offer to the world and earn this foreign currency, that affect our stock of foreign currencies within the country to meet our foreign currency obligations. So it is that poor production level or poor offering level to the international market that is at the heart of driving our currency instability or poor exchange rate of the currency across most parts of Africa. We are import dependent largely, including even food items.
Right, I want to talk about power now. Power crisis in Ghana, in Nigeria, in South Africa have put a lot of businesses to their knees. How important is it for African countries, Leslie, to deal with your power situation? And perhaps if you could tell us, what's the best way out?
Well, energy is at the heart of industry, and the power situation is quite stable now in Ghana, but indeed was a problem between 2012 and 2016, when it decimated economic activity and led to the economy recording, very low growth rates. The problem in the energy sector now in Ghana is that whereas we have been able to keep the lights on this time, we have done that at a very high cost. During the last power crisis, the government's attempt to deal with the problem led to it signing a number of emergency power purchase agreements, so that now we have contracted to buy substantially more electricity than we need. And these contracts were procured at what they term in the industry take or pay standards. So therefore, once the power has been produced, you have to pay for it whether or not you need it. And it has contributed to the serious fiscal crisis the government is facing. Surely, if Africa is to improve its economic independence, if Africa is to improve its fiscal position, then the energy situation is something we ought to address. That would require investments by both the state and the private sector. Sometimes it may require partnerships with overseas investors, etc. But surely it's something that Africa has to address.
Well, Leslie and Gbolahan, we'll take a moment. When we come back, we'll dig in deep, because listening to Leslie, it would mean as if we haven't seen any of such investments in any of these countries. We have seen quite a number of investments. We're looking at the hand of corruption in the fight against some of these policies for the continent. When we return, stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Village Square Africa with me and Sulai.
We are also talking to our guest from Ghana, Leslie Dwight Mensah. He is Economist and Research Fellow at the Institute for Fiscal Studies in Accra, Ghana. Also, we have Gbolahan Olojede, who is Executive Director, DMA Advisory and Management Services Limited. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for staying with us here. And if I should come back to the conversation, Gbolahan, the problem with Africa's debt management, with its currencies, with inflation across the country, one of the solutions that we are hoping would work for us will be the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which began earnestly this year. But what are your projections, and what would its impact be on the African economy?
Okay, you're asking about the impact of debt on African economy?
No, I'm asking about the ability to trade amongst ourselves, the impact of that on our economies.
Okay, the African trade agreement is there, it's adopted by literally all the countries, the continent. But the question still goes back to what does Africa? I foresee a situation in which at the early year of this trade agreement, it will actually be foreigners that will be the major beneficiary. China, Europe will come in to Africa with these knocked out parts and all the rest, and do some basic assembly in some of this country, and then we can trade among ourselves those products. But when you look through it, you find out that a significant part of that value chain is not from within Africa. It's only the finishing that will happen mostly around here, and we'll trade among ourselves. So we need to, Africa needs to build its industrialization base better than what we have right now. We must be able to move away from being commodities driven, whether the hard commodities or the soft commodities. That is what has largely driven the economics of 90% of Africa. So it's something to move away from. Of course, as far as commodities is concerned, Africa can deal with commodities among themselves. But the industrialization base is still very weak. Most of those issues of industrialization, the key core beneficiary will still be coming from outside of Africa in the early days.
Gbolahan, let me jump in here before we come to Leslie, and this would amaze you, because I've actually done some reports on that, and it's amazing to see that it's quite easy for an average African to do business from the continent to other parts of the world, specifically to Europe, than for a Nigerian businessman to move his goods to Ghana. It's quite more expensive for a Ghanaian to move his goods to Nigeria. It's easier and cheaper for these two businessmen or women to move their goods to Europe. Tell us, what is it that the African leaders and their team of economists are not getting right to the extent that this is not helping the growth of business? Gbolahan, are you there?
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Of course, some of these issues, some of the inter-country tariff issues have been addressed under the African Trade Agreement to ensure that those limitations across borders within Africa will be minimized to the barest minimum, and Africa can trade more with itself or within itself. However, there are still issues of infrastructure. I'll give you an example. I had a business partner who was representing Africa. They were from Europe, but he was representing Africa. And he told me that, look, I would rather sit in Paris and oversee Africa than sit in any part of Africa. I said, why is that? He said, because from Paris, I can get to any part of Africa, or literally on a daily basis, than I can within Africa. It means that within Africa, that even if you choose Nigeria, if you choose Kenya, if you choose South Africa, you do not have that flexibility to wake up and in South Africa and say you want to go to a particular country in Africa at will. Because unlike what you will have in Paris or in other parts of Europe, where there are flights going out of Paris to every part of Africa almost on a daily basis. So there are also the infrastructure constraints that are there. But we can be deliberate. Africa can be more deliberate about this issue and start to address it. All those trans-country pipelines, for example, for energy, are things that Africa needs to address. All those road network that link African countries are things that Africa needs to consider. They are part of the necessary infrastructure that will facilitate trade within Africa.
Let me bring in Leslie. Leslie, still about the same issue. It's no-brainer that Africans look at the subcontinental, organization, ECOWAS, AU, and even when you go to the SADC, looking at the continent as a whole. How is it that till this moment our leaders haven't been able to unlock these drawbacks that are so inimical to the growth of the continent?
Well, the structural barriers, to the realization of, these lofty economic dreams that have for decades not been addressed or not been sufficiently addressed. So you could say that there's been more talking than acting, essentially. Now, what is long been an objective of African nations to industrialize, and to expand their export potentials, and one of the prerequisites for that is market access, access to markets to export your manufactures to. And that primarily is what AFTA provides. AFTA essentially is an agreement, that guarantees market access within Africa to all participants. Now, once that arrangement has been installed, which is the case now, the challenge is then thrown back to the individual African nations and governments to prepare themselves in terms of their competitiveness, in terms of the strength and efficiency of their business environments to take advantage of this opportunity. And so those long-standing structural challenges, the inadequacy of trade infrastructure, for example, in many African economies, goods are traded by road. Trucks have to move from one country through several borders to another country to offload. That's how trade takes place in many jurisdictions. And in many cases on this truck ride between borders, there are many customs officials taking bribes, etc., all of which add to the cost of doing business for the average African businessman. There's the issue of the quality and adequacy of infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, which we discussed a while ago. The ports, the size and efficiency of African ports are crucial matters that have to be addressed. The reliability, independence, and credibility of the judiciary, the turnaround when cases go to court. All these things affect investments both by the local private sector in Africa and foreigners. And it is these challenges that ought to be addressed before AFTA can succeed. The leaders are to be congratulated for reaching the agreement to guarantee market access. But the real hard work begins now in preparing their domestic private sectors to reach a level of competitiveness such that they can compete with producers from outside Africa who also are interested in selling goods to the African market.
Right, I want to talk about Ghana for a bit. The country for the umpteenth time will be is running to the IMF for a bailout for help to salvage its economy. Leslie, tell us what the government of Ghana is looking for from the IMF.
Well, first and foremost, the government is looking for policy credibility. because at the moment, investors, both local and foreign, have completely lost confidence in the government's attempts to revive the economy and its financial position, And so the government feels that if it should court the assistance of the IMF, so that the IMF plays the role of a big brother, ensuring that whatever economic and fiscal reforms that ought to be implemented to get us out of this situation are implemented, then the market will regain confidence, and the flight by investors from the economy will be halted, and at some point the country will be able to regain access to the international financial markets. Because indeed, one of the triggers, actually, although Ghana's government finances have been in poor shape for quite some time, as I said, even before the pandemic, one of the triggers for the crisis we are in now is the loss of market access by Ghana at the start of this year. Loss of access by Ghana to the international bond markets. Because in each of the last 9 years, what the country has done is to go to the Eurobond market to raise financing to support the budget as well as to support the balance of payments position. And this year, once the investor community came to the realization that the fiscal situation was not improving as the government had been promising, they denied us access to the market by raising the yields, on our bonds. And because we're not able to go to the market to raise the billions that we traditionally have been able to bring in, a gap opened up in the balance of payments, and that put pressure on the exchange rate. So the government primarily is looking for policy credibility so that in the short term, investors will regain confidence and bring their investments into Ghana. But over the medium term, a number of reforms to public revenue and expenditure will have to be agreed, with the ultimate aim of narrowing the presently wide gap between public revenue mobilization and expenditure, and therefore reversing the last decade of debt accumulation.
Let me bring in Gbolahan here. Before we went on the break, I did say we're going to explore another angle. Gbolahan, help us. How much of an impact is corruption, in the economies of these two African countries in focus, Ghana and Nigeria? You can help us out with that of Nigeria.
Okay. Corruption is a major issue. Think about it. The budget for pill subsidy, PMS subsidy in Nigeria for this year was about 4.3 trillion naira. Now, Nigeria is spending 4.3 trillion naira on pill subsidy, but it doesn't even know for sure how much pill it consumes. I still remember the Honorable Minister of State for Petroleum saying that at the public event. I wasn't sure of the correctness of the consumption numbers being rolled out in Nigeria. So how do you spend 4.3 trillion on an item and you're not even sure of the basis for which that expenditure is being made? It is not because we cannot determine the consumption of Nigeria. It is because we have chosen not to determine that consumption. And we chose it because we are deliberately leaving that hole, that space, for corruption purposes. That is the only explanation that makes sense, that a country will spend that much money and doesn't care, has not been deliberate about ascertaining for sure the actual consumption of that product is subsidized. So everywhere you turn, you see elements of this. Even the crude oil production that we're talking about, from the pipeline issues to other possible documentary corruption that have been taking place inside of offices. Not necessarily on the field where the pipelines are running now. So these issues are material. Shouldn't we be asking the question, for example, that how did we, a nation that produced 2.5 million barrels, arrive at this junction where we are doing 930? 36,000 barrels. But those questions are not being addressed with the kind of seriousness that we expected, because the room out there is that room of corruption. It is the killing factor in Nigeria, I dare say most African economies.
Let me bring in Leslie. Leslie, I think some of us, followed the elections in Ghana, the last election, and and that is why some Ghanaians, especially young Ghanaians, are disappointed at what deal they're getting at the moment. And you say it's deeper than deep, and to the extent, excuse me, to the extent that the country might be looking out externally, talking about IMF, coming in. Paint a picture for us. How dire? I know you've already said it is a bad, but how dire is this to the extent that continent always looks outside? For instance, IMF.
Well, one of the ways to guarantee economic or financial independence, and this is true for an individual, is true for a business, and it is true for a nation, is to manage your resources and your finances prudently. I mean, any entity that fails to manage their resources or their finances prudently will always be beholden to external forces, including external lenders. Now, this has historically and in contemporary times remains a major problem of African economies. The fact that we are wont to spend substantially beyond our means and to accumulate these excessive imbalances between revenue and expenditure, which we cover through borrowing, including substantial borrowing from overseas. And therefore, we are compelled every now and then to dance to the tune that is played by our creditors and the persons or investors that have risked their funds with us. So that is at the core, I must say, of the crisis in many African economies now. It's easy to assume that it is these recent shocks, that really are to blame. But before these shocks surfaced, in many countries, the financial states of governments were quite poor. Okay, so that's one. Second, it is important for African governments and nations to assume greater control of the benefits from the exploitation of their natural resource endowments. Across many African countries, you'll find that the proportion of the benefits or earnings from natural resource endowments that goes to either states or the local private sectors is much, much lower than is the case, for example, in other natural resource rich countries like those in the Gulf. Now, this ought to change because these periodic hard currency crunches on a continent that is rich in natural resources, on a continent from whose shores billions of dollars worth of minerals and hydrocarbons are being transported all the time, is a paradox. So again, it's something that ought to be addressed. And then finally, in many African economies, there's a dire need for a diversification strategy, so that once exports are diversified, economy's resilience to external shocks will be strengthened.
Leslie, while we are on the bailout issue and we wind down on the program today, the president of Ghana has resisted calls to fire his finance minister, but this is the same man who's at the helm of affairs, even in negotiations for the IMF. How much confidence and trust does it bring to the table in delivering on an IMF bailout?
Well, frankly, my own view is that, Ghana's problem is not with the personnel, managing the finances. It's really a problem of, of unhealthy public finances, and there has been an investor reaction to that. I don't think that will change if the person at the helm changes. What needs to change is a policy set. Once the policy set changes and better, more prudent financial decisions are made, investors will come back to us. So that's my view on that.
Well, Gbolahan, so tell us as we wrap up, what are the low-hanging fruits, economic changes that you'd expect African governments, particularly those reeling under post-pandemic effects and Russia-Ukraine war effects on their economies? What would you expect them to be doing now?
Okay, it would depend on the situations of each of those countries. If you take in Nigeria, for example, one of the lowest hanging fruits is actually to shore up the oil production in Nigeria. A country that had produced 2.5 million should not be producing around 6,000. Now, so all those leakages, all those illegal pipes here and there, all those documentary stealing in the offices or at the terminals, we need to put a stop to it with all the seriousness in our vein. That is because oil price right now is at its best. How are we as an oil-producing country not benefiting from that? In fact, when you see the recent downgrade of Nigeria's rating by Fitch, that was the basis. Fitch was asking, you guys are oil producers. Oil is selling at this much in the market, but you are not making money from that oil. Simple as that. If we deal with that singular problem alone, it will not only increase our revenue, it will also help with our foreign exchange problem. Since crude oil represents 90% of our foreign exchange earnings. So in the short term, we must deal with that problem. There are other issues of economic distortion, from subsidy issues to food sustainability issues. Take food, for example, because this is very important. See, one of the primary drivers of our inflation numbers is the food. Now, we do a lot of importation of food-related items. When you go to a country that is experiencing inflation and you go and do those importations into your country, what you're also doing is that you are importing part of that inflation from that country into your own country. So issues like issues of yield, even on products that are of 3-month cycle, products like maize, like rice, where in Nigeria, we are doing an average of less than 2 tons per hectare, whereas there are countries like Ethiopia is doing 4.2, South Africa is doing 4.9, Egypt is doing 8. We don't even want to go to the West like America, where they are doing already 12 tons, more than 12 tons per hectare. These are issues that are low-hanging. We need to deploy the better seedlings, improve on the farm practices, and we can begin to reap fruit in the near term. So those are some of the low-hanging.
Well, I really hope we can stay on this, but again, quite a lot we've been able to get here. The country, specifically Ghana, needs a bailout, and we've also looked at the issue of corruption and the capabilities of Africa and African countries to actually get its economy up and running. And we really do hope that some of the experts like Leslie and Gbolahan and so many other Africans analyzing and trying to gauge the economies of these countries will be brought to bear. I'd like to thank you for your time. Leslie Mensah, many thanks for being such nice company. And of course, Gbolahan Olojede, many thanks as always for your time. And for those watching across the continent, you can catch up on our website, newscentral.africa. From us here, it's bye-bye.
Well, thank you too for being nice company. My name is Camille Yamana. Good night.